I didn't come to the gym looking for anything new. It was just my escape, a routine, a rhythm. But then he showed up, and somehow, without saying much at all, he started changing everything. The gym had always been a quiet space for me, a place where the noise of everyday responsibilities could be muted by the rhythm of movement and focus. I had walked through its glass doors hundreds of times, familiar with the clank of weights and the steady hum of determination that filled the air. Yet that evening, something felt different, even before I knew why. There was an unusual charge in the air, the kind that settles into your chest before you even understand what's changed. My routine was the same: stretch, warm up, lift, but my attention drifted. Across the room stood someone I hadn't seen before, a newcomer, younger, with a kind of presence that was hard to ignore. He moved through his exercises with a level of purpose that reminded me of how I once trained: focused, driven, immersed. It wasn't just his form or the control in his movements that caught my eye. It was the calm intensity in his expression, the way he seemed to be fully in the moment, free of distractions. There was no swagger in his demeanor, only quiet confidence. When our eyes met briefly during a water break, he nodded, and I returned the gesture without thinking. Something about that silent acknowledgement lingered longer than it should have. I tried to recenter myself, to push the distraction aside. I had always kept to myself at the gym. It wasn't a place for small talk or socializing. It was where I came to reset. But each time I looked up, he was still there, still focused, still calm. I wasn't used to this sensation, this magnetic pull of curiosity that made me lose track of my reps. It wasn't anything overt, just an undercurrent I couldn't explain. Days passed, and he continued to appear around the same time I did. Our routines began to overlap. A nod became a passing smile, and eventually we'd exchange brief greetings, nothing beyond casual acknowledgement. Still, there was something quietly exhilarating about it, the way small rituals began to feel charged with something unspoken. His name, I would later learn, was Michael Lane. But back then, he was simply the young man with a steady gaze and a disciplined routine. And somehow, knowing he'd be there made the idea of returning to the gym feel less like habit and more like anticipation. I started noticing small things: how he always adjusted the weights before wiping them down, how he offered a spot without being asked, how his focus never wavered. Those subtle observations grounded me. They made me aware of my own rhythm, of how much I had allowed my life to settle into predictable lines. It wasn't attraction in the traditional sense, at least not at first. It was something gentler, more disarming, a sense that there was connection possible, even in the quietest spaces. It had been a long time since someone had unsettled my equilibrium without saying more than a few words. One evening, as I was finishing my last set, he approached. He offered a hand with a barbell, unassuming, respectful, without pretense. I accepted. As he helped steady the weight, there was a moment, a breath caught between exertion and stillness, where our eyes locked with quiet recognition. Nothing was said, yet something passed between us. Mutual respect, perhaps. A silent alignment. After that brief moment, we exchanged names. The kind of exchange that should have felt ordinary, but didn't. There was an ease to it, a flow in conversation that followed. We spoke for longer than I expected, about routines, goals, the mental clarity that came with training. The conversation stretched beyond the gym's closing time, and when we eventually parted ways, I carried with me a strange sense of calm and clarity I hadn't felt in years. That night, I found myself replaying our interaction in my head, not searching for deeper meaning, but simply acknowledging the comfort it brought. There was nothing dramatic about it, no grand declarations or revelations. Just two people sharing space, rhythm, and understanding. As the days continued, so did the quiet cadence we'd found. We didn't speak much, but the silence felt full rather than empty. It was enough for now. And for the first time in a long while, I began to look forward to something I couldn't quite name, rooted in a connection I hadn't expected but quietly welcomed. The gym, once a space of repetition and solitary movement, began to take on a new texture as the days unfolded. What had started as passing glances and brief nods between me and Micah Lane slowly began to evolve into a quiet rhythm, one built not on obligation, but on curiosity. We found ourselves arriving around the same time almost every day, often ending up on machines or benches positioned just within each other's line of sight. There was no deliberate coordination, no messages exchanged, only the consistent, wordless synchronization of presence. And yet, I felt that each time our paths crossed, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a calm awareness that made each session feel less mechanical. The first real conversation happened between sets, a casual moment stretched out longer than either of us likely intended. It was nothing out of the ordinary, simple talk about routines, preferred lifts, shared frustrations with plateaus, but it carried a tone that felt easy, unforced. It was rare for me to feel that level of comfort with someone I barely knew, especially in a setting I'd long guarded as my own personal space. After that day, our interactions grew gradually. Sometimes we would train side by side, sharing space without needing to fill it with constant talk. Other times, we would exchange short reflections between exercises. It was never about impressing one another. If anything, it was the absence of pretense that made it feel grounding. Micah had a way of carrying energy that didn't demand attention, but still drew it. He spoke openly when he did speak, with a sincerity that was disarming. He asked questions that were thoughtful, not intrusive, about my approach to training, about what kept me coming back after all these years. I found myself answering more honestly than I intended. Perhaps it was the lack of judgment in his expression. Perhaps it was something else I couldn't quite name. One evening, as the gym began to thin out, he mentioned a juice bar across the street. It wasn't an invitation, not explicitly, but the implication hung gently in the air, and I found myself agreeing to join him without hesitation. We walked side by side, the silence between us as comfortable as the light breeze cutting through the evening air. At the bar, we settled into a booth by the window, our conversations moving beyond fitness and into pieces of our lives that rarely surfaced with strangers. He spoke of his work, his aspirations, the long hours that left him both exhausted and motivated. I listened, surprised by how easily he shared. In return, I offered fragments of my own journey, how the gym became my way of anchoring through transitions I hadn't always seen coming. There was no moment of revelation, no sudden emotional turning point, but something softened. The way he looked at me held a quiet understanding, and the way I responded surprised even myself. I hadn't expected a simple post-workout drink to leave me feeling so settled. After we parted ways that evening, I noticed how the routine had changed. The gym, once a place of silent structure, now held layers of anticipation. I began arriving just a little earlier, wondering if he'd already be there. And more often than not, he was warming up, his focus momentarily shifting as I entered, a slight nod acknowledging something neither of us needed to say aloud. As the weeks continued, so did this unspoken connection. It wasn't about redefining anything or rushing into clarity. It was simply about allowing space for something unfamiliar to take root. For the first time in a long while, I welcomed that uncertainty, because beneath it was something sincere, a bond that asked nothing, offered presence, and gave each day a quiet sense of forward motion. Whatever this was, it wasn't noise. It was something deeper, something quietly unfolding with each shared moment, rep, and glance. And though I didn't know where it might lead, I knew I would keep showing up, ready to find out. The shift that had begun with shared routines and unspoken rhythms gradually grew into something I could no longer dismiss as incidental. What started as a comforting familiarity with Micah Lane turned into a presence that lingered even outside the walls of the gym. He had become a part of the structure of my days, not in a disruptive way, but as something that brought unexpected clarity. One evening, after a particularly focused session, we left the gym together, our paths naturally aligned. The evening air was cool, and the streets were quiet, lit by the soft glow of passing traffic and storefronts beginning to close for the night. There was a calm between us, not uncomfortable, but reflective. I mentioned a small cafe a few blocks away, and without hesitation, he agreed. We found a quiet booth near the back, tucked away from the low hum of the room. There was something about the low lighting and the casual setting that invited openness. Our conversation wandered, flowing more freely than it ever had inside the gym. We spoke about family, his distant but supportive mind scattered and complicated. He shared stories from his childhood, his aspirations that had shifted since college, and how he still wasn't entirely sure where he'd land. I listened, not because I felt obligated, but because I genuinely wanted to understand the person sitting across from me. In turn, I offered my own truths. Not the polished surface-level facts I'd grown accustomed to sharing, but the quieter thoughts I usually kept to myself. How age had begun to feel less like a number and more like a lens through which I viewed the world. How the gym had become more than routine. It had turned into the one place where time didn't feel like it was slipping away. Micah listened intently, and his silence felt reassuring rather than distant. As the conversation deepened, so did the sense of ease between us. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a shared understanding that whatever was building between us didn't need to be named to be real. It lived in the way he smiled when I spoke, in the thoughtful pauses before he responded, in the simplicity of sitting across from someone and feeling seen. When we eventually left the cafe, we walked slowly, neither of us in a hurry to part ways. The night was quiet, the sidewalks mostly empty. As we reached the usual corner where we would separate, there was a brief pause, a moment where both of us seemed to register the weight of the connection we had formed. There were no dramatic words, just a quiet acknowledgement in the way our eyes met before we turned in different directions. In the days that followed, something had undeniably shifted. Our routines in the gym were unchanged in form, but the atmosphere was different. Every exchange carried more weight. Every conversation lingered longer. The quiet glances between sets held a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about declarations or redefining boundaries. It was about the comfort of mutual presence, about knowing someone was truly paying attention without demanding anything in return. I found myself thinking about our conversations long after they ended, recalling small details in the way one might treasure the subtle brushstrokes in a favorite painting. Micah continued to show up, steady, focused, engaged. And I did too, no longer out of habit, but out of choice. There was a reassurance in knowing that no matter how the day unfolded, we'd return to that shared space, ready to pick up the rhythm we had built together. Though we still hadn't labeled anything between us, I no longer needed to. The bond we had created was becoming something more enduring than casual companionship. It was built on trust, on presence, on the kind of quiet connection that speaks volumes even when no words are exchanged. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not just grounded, but hopeful. This wasn't the kind of shift I had anticipated when I first noticed him across the gym floor. It was better. It was real. Despite how naturally everything had fallen into place between us, a quiet tension began to rise, not from anything either of us said, but from the weight of what remained unspoken. The consistency of our connection made the questions harder to ignore. What were we doing? Where was this going? And what did it all mean when life beyond the gym started creeping in? Micah and I continued to share the same routines, the same effortless conversations, but beneath the surface I began to feel a subtle pressure building. It wasn't rooted in dissatisfaction. On the contrary, I had never felt more present. But moments of stillness brought thoughts I hadn't allowed myself to fully explore, thoughts about age, about timing, about the inevitable complexities of two people whose lives were shaped by different stages. One evening, after we'd finished a longer than usual session, we sat on a quiet bench outside the gym, letting the cool air settle around us. The street was unusually still. For a while, we said nothing, both of us watching the rhythm of passing cars and distant headlights. There was no need to fill the silence, but I could sense that something had shifted in Micah's posture, a hesitance, a weight behind the way his hands moved, slower, more deliberate. Eventually, he turned to me with a look that suggested a question forming just behind his expression. He didn't speak aloud, but I understood it all the same. It was in the way his eyes searched mine, not for answers, but for reassurance. We both knew things had become more than casual, more than routine, and with that realization came the inevitability of facing it. I considered saying something. I wanted to offer certainty, to express how deeply I valued what had grown between us. But I also knew that pretending there were no complications would have been dishonest. I had lived long enough to understand that connection, no matter how sincere, didn't exist in a vacuum. Later that week, as we walked together down a familiar stretch of sidewalk, I found myself reflecting aloud, carefully, cautiously. I spoke not of fears, but of the reality that life was rarely as simple as it felt in those perfect gym sessions or quiet cafe conversations. I mentioned the differences in our worlds, not as barriers, but as facts worth acknowledging. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, yet open. When I paused, unsure of how my words had landed, he reached over, not dramatically, not even with emphasis, but with a quiet touch that rested gently on my arm. That simple gesture grounded everything. It said, without saying, that he heard me and that he was still there. We didn't solve anything that night. There was no resolution, no defined path forward. But there was honesty, and in that honesty, a deeper kind of trust began to settle in. Not the kind that dismisses difficulties, but the kind that acknowledges them and chooses presence anyway. In the days that followed, we talked more openly, not constantly, not urgently, but with intention. We let the hard questions hang between us without demanding immediate answers. We returned to the gym as usual, but even in our quietest moments, there was an understanding that we were no longer pretending not to care. The comfort I found in Micah hadn't changed, but now it was accompanied by a sense of commitment to navigating the unknown. There were still doubts, of course. There were moments where I questioned whether it could last, whether we were risking something too fragile. But every time I considered retreating, I found myself pulled back by the memory of his voice, his presence, his steadiness beside me. What we had was real, and real things aren't always clean, or easy, or simple. They require attention. They require choice. And in the quiet of those days, through the workout routines, the post-gym walks, the candid exchanges under dim city lights, we were making that choice. Even without a map, even without a label. We didn't need to have all the answers yet. What mattered was that we were still showing up for ourselves and for each other. And that was enough to keep going. The weeks that followed moved quietly, but with intention. There was no dramatic turning point between Micah and me. No sweeping declarations or sudden clarity. Instead, we found ourselves gradually settling into something that felt real, something steady. It wasn't about defining what we were to each other, but about showing up consistently, honestly, and with a growing understanding of what mattered. Our workouts remained a central part of our routine. The gym still held its usual energy, the clang of metal and focused silence. But now it was also a place where I felt grounded not just in my body, but in something shared. We trained as before, spotting one another, exchanging ideas, but now with the comfort that comes from trust earned through time, not words. Outside the gym, our conversations continued. They shifted between the casual and the meaningful, depending on the night, depending on what either of us carried with us from the day. Some evenings were light, talking about music or food, or the absurdity of things we'd seen online. Other nights drifted into deeper territory. We spoke of decisions we regretted, dreams we still carried, and how the paths we were on had changed us. There was a moment during one of those walks, just after a quiet dinner, the sky turning dark and the sidewalks nearly empty, when I realized how rare this had become in my life, to feel fully seen without needing to explain myself. Micah had never asked for anything from me that I wasn't ready to give. And in return, I found myself offering more: trust, openness, presence, because with him, those things felt safe. We didn't avoid the harder conversations. The realities of our differences, the possible limitations, the uncertainties that inevitably came with choosing something undefined. They were still there. But they didn't dominate our time. They existed alongside what we were building, not as threats to it, but as elements to consider. We didn't pretend everything would be easy. Instead, we learned to live inside the possibility of what could be without demanding guarantees. As the season began to shift, air turning cooler, evenings arriving sooner, I noticed how naturally our routines had adapted. There was comfort in knowing his habits, his preferences, the small details that revealed themselves over time. Like how he always stretched twice as long after a tough workout, or how he instinctively offered me the last bite of dessert, even when I declined. These weren't grand gestures. They were small acts of attention, and they mattered. One weekend afternoon, we sat in a park after a long walk, watching dogs dart across a field while the city hummed faintly in the distance. We didn't talk much that day. There was no need. The quiet between us no longer held questions. It was simply part of how we communicated, a shared silence shaped by presence. In that stillness, I found something I hadn't known I was looking for. Not resolution, not certainty, but peace. A sense that whatever came next, I wasn't alone in navigating it. We had chosen to be here, without conditions, without needing to outline every step. And that choice, repeated day after day, meant more than any definition ever could. Micah and I hadn't arrived at a finish line. We hadn't solved everything or settled into a perfect narrative. But what we had was real, and it was ours. As I walked home that evening, the city lights blinking softly above, I thought about how easily I could have missed this, how close I came to dismissing a simple glance, a nod, a question at the gym. But something told me to stay open, and that decision had changed the rhythm of my life. Whatever the future held, I knew this. I would carry the stillness, the laughter, the shared weight of trust we had built together. Not just as memory, but as something living, something I would return to time and again for the quiet strength it gave me. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't shout. They unfold slowly, in the spaces between words, in quiet clarity.